Hey guys, it's Dean. Alright, I know this video seems like it's all over the place, but hear me out. While I said I'd be going through the series in release order, I also had somewhat of a caveat that I'd shuffle things around as I'd see fit. Going based off the US release dates, Mega Man 6 released in March of 1994, Mega Man 4 on the Game Boy released in December of 93, so I want to cover that game before going to the final NES game. But I'm not only doing that because of the chronology, I'm doing that because I want to button up the games that were derivatives of the titles prior to Mega Man 6. So Mega Man 4 on the Game Boy has elements of Mega Man 4 and 5 for the NES, so it just kind of works out that way. Now obviously, Mega Man for the Game Gear is a bit of an oddball because the game came out in 1995. The thing is, Mega Man for the Game Gear simply was called Mega Man and nothing else, but it's basically a compilation of 4 stages from 5, 2 from 4, and 1 from 2. I often see people question why they chose those games specifically, and my theory is that they didn't get to Mega Man 6 because when they started making the game, it might not have been even sure if that game was going to release in the West. And the Game Gear title was only released in North America. And the second thing is that Sega owners, specifically Sega Genesis owners, already got to play Mega Man 1 through 3 on the Wily Wars. So if you assume a Sega Genesis owner also had a Game Gear, the logical thing would be to put elements from Mega Man 4 and 5 on there to cover all bases. At least, again, that's my theory. Anyway, I figure it's worth covering the Game Gear game here, and getting it out of the way too before moving on to Mega Man 6. Additionally, between the years of 1993 and 1995, there was also the release of the Wily Wars, the first 3 Mega Man X games, Mega Man 7, as well as Soccer and Power Battle. And while Mega Man 7 is a classic Mega Man game, it's an SNES Mega Man game, so it's a bit more advanced than the first 6 titles that I would group on their own. I want to wrap everything up related to those 6 titles mainly. Today will be Mega Man 4 for the Game Boy, and Mega Man for the Game Gear, and next time we'll cover Mega Man 6, the final NES title, followed by Mega Man 5, the final Game Boy title, followed by the Wily Wars to finish off what I would consider the first phase of this whole experience. Depending on how I feel about all this when it's all said and done, I might move on to something else for a bit and come back for phase 2, but it depends on how mega burnt out I'm feeling as I go. But I'm just putting all this information out there so you're kept in the loop. Also, in my Wily Wars video, I haven't decided if I'll be going over the Sequel Wars ROM hack yet, or if I'm going to wait for all 3 episodes to be completed before revisiting that. We'll see. So I'm going to start off with the Game Gear title because that game is much more derivative, so I don't have as much to say about it as I do the Game Boy game. Right off the bat, can I just say I like this? I know it gets a huge amount of hate and the screen crunch is completely scrutinized, and many people cite frustration with this title, but I quite frankly don't see it as much. And I'm willing to concede that maybe if I was playing this on original hardware it would have been a lot worse. I think I saw some reviewers back from the time of the release complaining about the controls on the actual hardware being hard to work around, and I'm guessing the screen crunch was a lot worse on the small screen as well. But playing it blown up, I gotta say this looked almost as good as the NES games, maybe even a little better in certain situations. There were some minor differences in the colors used and a few notable palette changes, but for the most part this looked very similar to what I experienced on the NES, just more zoomed in. So in the Game Boy titles, the developers went for the approach where you blow up the sprites and shrink the room sizes and you had a literal pocket-sized adventure of Mega Man. In the Game Gear version, the stages are almost identically one-to-one as the NES counterparts. Like, the changes in the stages are negligible, and I thought about going through the video and pointing out all of the changes I could spot instead, but I don't think that's really worth mine or your time. The biggest changes are E-tanks or 1-ups in places of hidden letters that were spotted in the NES versions, to be honest. The issue is, since they decided to go with the zoomed-in approach, I think a lot of people had issues with the screen crunch. Now honestly, I didn't find an issue with this. I think the primary reason for that is the fact that I recently went through all of these stages, and so a lot of it was fresh in my memory. You also have the ability to hold the jump button plus up or down to shift the screen so you can see what's above or below you, which does drastically slow things down a bit and in a lot of cases isn't fast enough to stop you from taking damage, but it was still useful to make sure I didn't make any dumb jumps into a pit that would guarantee me death. That being said, even without the option to shift the screen, is doing a trust fall jump into a death pit really all that different than the usual experience for Mega Man? In literally every game I've played in this series, there are multiple moments where I jump down somewhere and I'm greeted with death. Or even in the opposite end. So many times in these games I'm just randomly walking and I get struck from something off of screen, above or below, or to the side of me. None of this really feels out of place. Like, I understand that it's not what the designers intended, but it didn't feel foreign or different. And the music for the most part is consistent with the NES. I think Wave Man's stage has Gravity Man's music, and the Wave Man's music became the Game Over music. But aside from that, it sounds like the same, but inferior. But not so inferior that I'd like to throw up when I hear it like some reviewers online made it out to be. Another thing of note is that this game does not have any continues. However, there is a password system that takes you up until the last 2 or 3 stages. And if you're emulating, which I think since there's no official way to play this game outside of the Game Gear, most people are emulating, you can always use save states to get around. Now that being said, I didn't get a single game over, and I think I only lost a few lives. This game took me like 40 minutes to get through. It was very easy. I played through it on normal mode, and I did notice that enemies were easily killable and regenerator drops were plentiful, very similar to the normal mode when I played Mega Man 2 for the NES. So I decided I'd try it again on hard mode, and I actually beat the game even faster on hard mode by a few minutes. Like, what exactly are people struggling with here? Unless this is literally the only Mega Man game you've ever played, I don't understand why you'd find it so difficult. Since this game is mostly based off Mega Man 5, the Mega Buster is at full width and is pretty strong. I think I saw complaints that the Pea Shooter can only do 2 shots at a time on screen, but they also made the Mega Buster worth more damage to counter that, so I didn't really struggle. Also, there were some comments about iframes that suggested that you can't spam attacks at enemies, but these are all things that I literally didn't notice while playing and only noticed while doing research for this video. Maybe I'm just not very good at the series and people play more efficiently than I do, so this stuff doesn't set me back as much as it sets others back? I don't know. But throughout the game, there aren't any shops, there aren't any collectibles outside of E-Tanks, you have a rush coil and that's it. It's a very streamlined experience, which is perfect for a handheld. Mega Man 5 was also the game that struggled the most with the Robot Master weapons being useful when I played them, so given that this game was mostly a derivative of that one, I spent the whole game with nothing but the Mega Buster and Pea Shooter outside of the boss battles. It's actually the worst lineup of weapons probably in the whole series. The first 4 stages are Stone Man, Star Man, and Napalm Man from Mega Man 5, and Bright Man from Mega Man 4. None of those weapons are really all that useful as typical projectiles. I mean, sure, you could still find ways to make use out of them if you really wanted to, but they're hardly the type of weapon you'd use to really simplify your run through a stage, and more like a situational thing you can use 2 or 3 times and burn through the ammo quickly. So for the first 4 stages, the Mega Buster is your best bet no matter which order you go in. Something strange, however, is that when you move on to the mid-game, the game flashes Cossack's castle on the screen, but Cossack is literally never mentioned at all throughout the game. It's just like, here's a fortress with these 2 stages, and then they chose Cossack's fortress for some reason. Actually, with that note, I should mention that the start screen is from Mega Man 4, and the opening cutscene is a derivative of Mega Man 4 as well. Anyway, the mid-game entails 2 stages you have to do in order. The first one is Wave Man stage from Mega Man 5. Wave Man has no weaknesses, and you're meant to use the Mega Buster against him. The stage is once again mostly a 1-to-1 of the NES version, including the bubble puzzle and the surfing section. And I swear if I hadn't just done the bubble puzzle, I would have never been able to pass through it on a zoomed-in screen unless I used a guide. The surfing section and the octopus fight felt like a similar enough difficulty to the NES versions, where they are challenging, but there are a lot of health drops to get you through it. Speaking of which, the E-Tanks were not all that common to come by, but given the ease of this game and how many 1-ups I ran into, I managed to save my E-Tanks for the last couple of boss fights, and that worked out for me. Anyway, after Wave Man, the next Cossack Fortress stage is Toadman's, which again is very similar to what we saw in Mega Man 4. However, and this might be controversial, but this is the best Toadman fight in the series, because it's the most difficult version of Toadman since he leaps around more haphazardly than he did on the NES and Game Boy. You can still more or less defeat him the same way you did before, but you might take a few hits and might have to use an E-Tank. Oh, and another thing I forgot to point out, there's an M-Tank in this game, but it's hidden somewhere in the Snowman stage and I didn't find it. So yeah, I imagine that would be a useful thing to collect too if you're struggling. Anyway, after Toadman stage, you finish the Cossack Fortress portion and get to the Wily Fortress, and you're literally thrown right into Quickman stage from Mega Man 2. But it's not Quickman's actual stage, like Quickman isn't there. It's just his fast-paced stage with no flash stopper. And Brightman's ability doesn't do anything either, so you have to basically fall down and just dodge all the lasers. This is probably where most people get their game over, and the last password saved would be Wave Man stage, so you'd have to redo that stage and Toadman stage, and that's only if you remember to get that password. But anyway, I realize I whined a lot about Quickman stage when I did Mega Man 2, but this was a million times easier because of 2 main changes. The first change is, I don't know the exact hitbox, but I think if you skin the edges of the lasers instead of the middle of them, you take damage instead of getting insta-killed, which means you can use your iframes to drop down much quicker now. And second, you have a slide, which is very useful for those quick moments where you need to squeeze over the edge to survive. So while I still don't like the stage, it didn't feel nearly as impossible. Now granted, I also played Mega Man 2 again recently because I wanted to go through Quickman stage without using the flash stopper, so I had a bit of practice. But come on, anyone else who plays Mega Man on the Game Gear usually has much more experience with the series than I do, so I find it odd that I didn't find this at all that annoying. After Quickman stage, you just go through a long hallway, which I think is literally the end of a Wily Fortress stage in Mega Man 5. You kill a single turret, and you face Wily Capsule in the exact same fight you faced him in Mega Man 5. The difference for me though was that on the NES I had beat, so I didn't really have to try. In this case, I had to learn the patterns and attack rather than just focus on my defenses. So this final fight was probably the most unique experience for me from this whole game. But again, it was all Mega Buster here. Like, you get Waveman's weapon and you can only really use it on Toadman stage, but why even bother when the Mega Buster is more useful since you have to be on the ground to use the Waveman weapon? And you get Toadman's rain attack, but you can only really use it against Wily, and I tried that, but the Mega Buster gave me more damage. Also, it's harder to time the rain attack. So I've already said more about this game than I probably needed to say. Do I think it's good? Sure, I mean, if you have no other option and no other Mega Man game to play, I think you can enjoy it. Do I think it's worth going out of your way to try? Once again, yeah, I think it's worth it just to kind of mix things up a bit and see if you can beat a zoomed-in hard mode compilation of 7 stages across 3 games. Especially considering that this can all probably be finished in less than an hour with practice, and probably a maximum of an hour and a half even with no practice. I'm even willing to go out on a limb and say that this is a better game than a few of the Game Boy ones, aside from experiencing it for the sake of experiencing it, and despite the fact that you can enjoy the experience. For me, I unfortunately do not see a point to return to this game. The 4 Mega Man 5 stages are better on the NES and have more weapon options and collectibles to make it more unique. The 2 Mega Man 4 stages would be better played on Mega Man 4, which I consider the best of the NES from the games that I've played so far. And Quickman stage from Mega Man 2, while superior to the NES counterpart, is still better to go through while playing Mega Man 2 because you can get the Flash Stopper. Really, the only benefit I can think of that might make me play it again is that it's watered down with no extra collectibles and power-ups, and in that regard it makes it feel like a simpler experience similar to the first Mega Man game, but with better stages and better controls. Like, it's a good way to kill 30 or 40 minutes. But aside from that, unless it's added to the NSO, and I'm on a plane looking for something to do on a short flight, I won't be revisiting this. And even if it is added to NSO, I still might play another Mega Man game. So yeah, it's a good game, but it's just too derivative and it makes the existence kind of pointless and kind of forgettable in the modern day. But if you were a Game Gear kid and didn't have any other Mega Man games and really wanted one, I think you could have done worse than what was offered with this title, despite all of its shortcomings. But let's be real, if you bought a Game Gear game, you didn't really deserve better than this junk anyway. After going through Mega Man 3 for the Game Boy, and the PC one as well for that matter, I was very relieved that my experience of Mega Man 4 on the Game Boy was more similar to my experience with the first 2 Game Boy titles. Mega Man 3 Game Boy frustrated the heck out of me, primarily because the entire game felt cramped and claustrophobic, because all of the challenges involved pixel-perfect jumps or absolutely annoying slowdowns against enemies. This game basically had none of that, and I'm very grateful for that because I really enjoyed the more leisure experience. Now to be clear, this game was more difficult than the first 2 Game Boy titles, but it had a good difficulty that was more focused on how you play rather than how the game could frustrate you. I use the word leisure, but really I meant that comparatively to the third game. It's not really all that relaxing of a game, after all it's still Mega Man, but there was a lot of the game that I was able to appreciate. The first thing to note is the game actually has a decent amount of effort put into the cutscenes and story. I'm not going to pretend it's anything groundbreaking, but I was much more engaged as I went through the few cutscenes in this title than I was in any of the other games before it. And the payoff at the end actually somewhat caught my attention, and it garnered an eyebrow raise out of me. As it goes, the game takes 4 Robot Masters from Mega Man 4, followed by 4 from Mega Man 5, with a couple of sub-bosses and fights against the Mega Man killers and Wily sprinkled around. The stages in this game actually felt pretty unique and felt much less like a retread of the NES games than all of the prior Game Boy games before, which is also a stark difference to the Game Gear title. I'm not going to spend too much time comparing these 2 titles, but it's fun to see the contrast between the 2 games and how they approach their handheld version of the games that took inspirations from Mega Man 4 and 5. As you go through the 4 stages, you can collect 4 letters to unlock Beat, which is helpful for the rest of the game. The second 4 stages allow you to collect letters to spell out Wily. Actually, up until writing the script, I didn't really think about what getting those 4 letters unlocked, so I just researched it and it turns out you actually have to collect those 4 letters to access Wily's fortress. So I'm glad I made a point to get them, although to be fair, they're mildly hidden at best. You'll also notice P-chips available to collect as you run through the stages. These serve as the game's currency and allow you the chance to purchase 1-ups, E-tanks, weapon balancers, and various other types of weapons and health regenerators, with very different costs to account for how many P-chips you have. I like the shop's implementation. I'm pretty sure it returns in future titles, and it all started with this game. I can totally understand why someone would find that it's somewhat of a crutch, but well, nobody's putting a pea shooter to your head and forcing you to buy anything. Anyway, I think I only really relied on the shop around the endgame, but I didn't really notice as many E-Tanks available on the maps as in previous Game Boy games, so maybe they added the shop as a way to balance that out. I'm not sure. Also, there are random hidden rooms where you can find Proto Man and he gives you stuff, but that's not anything I actually encountered, so I guess I didn't explore nearly as much as I should have. Obviously, you also have your typical inclusions that are staples by now. The slide attack, the Mega Buster, which still has that annoying noise like it did in Mega Man 3, but it's slightly less annoying. Rush Coil and Rush Jet are here too. Oh, also they added a boss rush for the first time in the Game Boy games. Like you have to refight all 8 of the robots you fought throughout the game in a typical elevator room. I didn't really like that. I probably sound like a broken record by now, but I only like boss rushes when it's the first time you experience a game or a boss. And since these bosses were all brought in from the NES versions, I already knew their weaknesses, so there was nothing exciting about the boss rush and it just felt like a short waste of time to repeat the fights the exact same way I already experienced them. But look, aside from that, I don't have much to add as far as the background of this game is concerned, and since these stages are actually unique, I think it's worth taking you all through my playthrough. The only thing I might have skipped over is that the general reception of this game seems to have always been pretty positive. And even the people that usually recommend skipping the first 3 Game Boy titles generally tend to recommend playing this one. Mega Man 5 for the Game Boy is still largely seen as the best one, but this one is still recommended to experience by the Mega Man community. So make of that what you will. Anyway, let's do this. This was a full 2-hour experience, so it should be fun to go through. Right off the title screen, I could tell they put a lot of effort into this one. Like, there's a nice little animation that's rare even for the NES games. The 4 Robot Masters with Wily in the background is a really cool opening, along with the next screen of the city exploding with a catchy tune followed by this shot of Mega Man and Wily, and then Mega Man and a mysterious robot killer, culminating with this final view of Mega Man charging up his Mega Buster. That's such a cool introduction. The game opens up with a cutscene that has actual text boxes. Dr. Light is notifying Mega Man that Dr. Wily has sent his most powerful robots around the world, and that Dr. Light has worked on a machine to create items to help Mega Man out. So this is not only to set up the game's story, but also serves to tell you that there are P-chips that you can collect to use as power to get items from Light throughout the game. Something else to note is that the Robot Master selection screen is very different than we're used to. Rather than the typical boss select screen, you get this weird rotating selection that has a preview of the upcoming stage. I don't really like this addition because I prefer the iconic stage select, but it doesn't mean I don't absolutely appreciate the effort they put into this. It was totally not necessary, but it makes the game more memorable and I can respect that. Anyway, I know Toadman is always an easy target, so I started there. You get the rain pushing you back, the water on the floor gimmick, but the immediate thing I noticed is that the way the stage is entirely different than the console counterpart. They basically made these perfectly original levels that include the same enemies and challenges, but found a way to make it its own thing. They even brought back the snail fight. After you get through the first snail, you can collect the beat letter before climbing up the ladder and getting to an area with jumping piranhas and weird Metroid-like enemies over the water. I wanted to highlight this moment here, as you drop down and notice an alcove to the right that has nothing in it, but when you see that, you're sort of incentivized to lean to the right. And sure enough, if you do that, you are then rewarded with a 1-up. The way they assist you through the trust fall without making it blatantly obvious is very good game design in my opinion. Anyway, when you drop down, you face off against another snail before getting to Toadman, and making super easy and light work out of him. Again, the animation and cutscene after you get the Rain Flush and Rush Coil is very charming. But now that we've been in Toadman, we can head over to Brightman's stage, where we go through his lights off and lights on gimmick. The platform challenges are pretty straightforward. I did notice these tiny E-Tank collectibles that are basically 1/4 of an E-Tank. Once you get 4, you get an E-Tank. You can't use them individually. You face more familiar enemies, including the weird gumball machine-like enemies, before making it to a dark section with glowing platforms that you have to maneuver through while dodging enemies that turn the lights off. Eventually, you get to this enemy that serves as a platform. When you stand on him, he moves to the right in a downward angle, and when he reaches the bottom of the screen, you have to hop to get him to move up in elevation before you fall to your death. It's an interesting and unique challenge, and made even more challenging when you approach the lights on and off enemies. As you move up, you face some similar challenges, but obviously the stage gets more difficult to maneuver around. Regardless, it's still doable. Finally, you make it to these swinging platforms that we've seen on the NES, and the Game Gear game for that matter. Actually, the funny thing to note is that the 2 Mega Man 4 stages in this game happen to be the same as the 2 Mega Man 4 stages that were in the Game Gear title, so you can really spot the different implementations like I mentioned earlier. Also from the Game Gear and included here are Stone Man and Napalm Man, so this game has 4 out of 6 Robot Masters that were on the Game Gear. The other two from the Game Gear being Waveman and Starman, who actually don't get another appearance on a Game Boy title since by the time we get to the 5th Game Boy title, they stopped reusing old Robot Masters. I guess as I'm on this tangent, the only Robot Masters from the first 5 Mega Man games that don't get handheld representation are Gravity Man from 5, if you don't count his music being in Waveman stage on the Game Gear, Gyro Man also from 5, although he does make it to battle in Fighters, and Bomb and Guts Man from the first game, but they show up in a lot of other titles. Just not these handheld ones. So if anyone is planning on making a random ROM hack or build a game from the ground up for Game Boy Color Mega Man, make sure to include those 4. And to quickly close out this tangent, I'm aware of Mega Man Mania, and I will be revisiting those games when they're all done. I might do the colorized Mega Man 5 ROM hack throw, since it seems like that's how everyone plays it. We'll see. Back to the swinging platforms. This area actually does offer quite a bit of a challenge, and even has the next beat letter to pick up while you're swinging through it. Beyond that, you make it to Brightman and use a Rain Flush to defeat him while hopefully avoiding as much damage as you can when he freezes you. Next up is Pharaoh Man. Again, same idea. All the elements are here, but it's much more Game Boy friendly. The music rocks though, and there's no random adapter collectible unfortunately. Not even an E-Tank in its place as a cool Easter egg. Anyway, you get through some narrow paths and these skeletons from the NES titles. If you notice, the skeletons could have easily slowed you down like the Hammer Joes did in the 3rd game, but they take less hits and don't have as small of a damage intake window, so they're not nearly as game-breakingly annoying. Just like how the jumps over bottomless pits here don't require you to jump off your tiptoe to make. Anyway, there are these blocks that fall down as you jump on them, requiring you to perform a quick slide before falling all the way down. Aside from that, many of the same challenges ensue, but you do have to do them over quicksand, or while dodging some flying enemies. Thankfully, since you have Rush Coil, you can restock some health and you can also collect the next beat letter and intentionally fall to your death. I like the different ways the blocks that fall are used to change the challenge in this area too. It's a good way to use a simple concept and change things up a bit. Finally, you get to Pharaoh Man, who was a joke again since we have Brightman's attack to stop him in his tracks. Next up is Ringman. I use Rain Flush throughout a lot of the earlier parts of the stage to get through some of these turrets while going through the sliding platforms through various areas, very similar to the NES version. The Rain Flush wasn't really all that required, I just kinda used it to make my life a bit easier. Also, I found Brightman's attack helpful against those ring bosses too. I think the Rain Flush was better to use on the NES, but I sort of burned through all of that ammo already. Anyway, the stage does last quite a while, and there are a ton of minor challenges that add up, but it's manageable and easy enough to get to Ringman. Hit him with a few fully charged Pharaoh shots, and you are now done Mega Man 4 stages of this game, as well as having beat unlocked. Wily shows up on the Robot Select stage, and there's a brief cutscene that shows him off in the distance in his giant fortress firing bombs at Mega Man, who is literally shooting back at him with his pea shooter before jumping to the machine and taking on his satellite concoction. Having beat and an energy tank made this fight a lot more manageable, but it was definitely hard for me to avoid taking damage. I doubt I'd have done it without beat. This next area requires you to shoot these explosive looking missiles to make it through the stage and get to Wily, before you're interrupted by the Mega Man killer Ballad. He's not the worst enemy to face, but you do have to jump around quite a bit to avoid his attacks. The pea shooter is your best bet here. When you defeat him, he jumps off and you get to a screen with the 4 Robot Masters from Mega Man 5. I decided to start with Charge Man. The stage takes place on top of the inside of a train, but it's very different to the console version in design and application. It actually feels more like a fortress stage, because it feels like I'm going through many of the same enemies and challenges that I went through in all of the previous stages, with certain applications of Rush when necessary and facing off against some of the familiar enemies from Mega Man 5 that took more time to defeat than regular enemies like the Giant Hen or the Gumball Shooting Guy. Along your path you'll also find your first Wily letter. Also throughout the stage I'd often find collectibles I had no idea how to grab, so I skipped them, but I found out later on that the ring attack could grab them. Anyway, Charge Man was easier here than he was on the NES because the Rain Flush was super strong against him, thankfully, so I could just focus on dodging him for the most part. With him down, we unlock the Rush Jet and can go after Crystal Man. Again, this stage just feels more like a fortress stage, especially when you start off with having to use both the Rush Coil and Rush Jet to get a quarter E-Tank. It still borrows a lot from the Crystal Man NES stage, like these crystal shooting robots and helicopters that attack you and pylons that slide towards you and unicycle robots. Ideally, you won't accidentally pass by the Wily letter as you get through the stage. It's on your path, but it's also easy to ignore by accident. This stage feels a lot more like the Mega Man 3 Game Boy stages if their challenges were implemented well and not trying to suffocate you. I can really appreciate the jump in difficulty without making it stupidly ridiculous. Crystal Man's weakness is the charge kick, and you finish him off with ease. Next up, Napalm Man. But before that, I stopped by Dr. Light's shop for the first time and purchased some items to help me out. I hadn't realized it, but the select button gets you to him. I guess I didn't really need to access him before this moment. The endgame was putting up quite a bit of a challenge. Napalm Man stage had the largest changes so far. I don't know if it's because they got some kind of backlash for making it Vietnam inspired, but it feels like that's the case because this one is very different. Again, it feels more like a fortress stage than anything else. Has a lot of these giant drills that in the NES games were a one-off challenge, but over here they are used as puzzle-like platforms to advance through the stage. I actually really like this. You have to also be careful not to touch the drill ends. Eventually, you get to the sections with the bullets that explode when you shoot them, as well as the annoying bullets that fly up from the bottomless pits that always seem to surprise me. A section with rush jet or rush coil helps you get to the Widely ladder, before making it to a portion of the stage where the floor starts to disappear as you run past it, so you have to move pretty quick to get through those sections. When you make it to Napalm Man, a few shots of the Crystal Eye should make him super easy to defeat. Finally, next up is Stone Man. The cave theme really shines here. It's cramped, has a dark background. Pretty soon after you enter the stage, you get to the Hippo mid-boss and have to use Rainflush a lot to defeat it. There are some narrow challenges over bottomless pits that require you to defeat one of a few different variants of enemies before making it to another Hippo. Once again, Rain Attack. As you get through the cave and collect your regenerators and defeat your enemies, you eventually make it to the final Wily ladder before getting into Stone Man and fighting him with a Napalm Bomb. He's very easy to defeat here. Since we have all 4 Wily ladders, we can take on Ballad now, but not before going through a mini fortress stage. The game is generous enough to provide an E-Tank to start you off, and it gives you some P-chips and ammo recharges before making it to Ballad. I experimented with my first life against him and found the stone attack really took his health down, so I stuck with that. When you beat him, you think you're done, but you're suddenly thrown into a section where the entire stage is collapsing. I'm not gonna lie, this whole ordeal was very stressful and I had to burn through a lot of my weapons to figure out what to use to blow up the missiles that were blocking my path. The Pharaoh shot was useful because it could shoot upwards or downwards, but it wasn't easy and it really required fast timing to get through. I even had to use an E-Tank because the explosions were getting to me. And beyond that, I had to use the special tank to refill all of my ammo too because I was never going to make it to this section without refilling my weapons. And the music added to the intensity of the situation. This was a very cool challenge and a great way to take us to the endgame. Or at least, I thought it was the endgame. Wily blasts off into outer space and a whole ship emerges. And Dr. Light gives you a quick chance to use your P-chips to refill some of those items before getting out there. At this point, I really thought I was about to go to the final boss, so I spent everything I had. Megaman flies up in a charming animation, and you make it to a bridge with exploding missiles. And you're meant to either shoot those missiles or dodge them altogether. After that, you get to some Mets on turrets that you have to defeat, and I did eventually figure out that you could stand right on his gun and shoot him point blank to make it very easy. There's also these annoying drill enemies that I found it was in my best interest to avoid and run forward, followed by helicopter flying Joes. I was really 2 seconds away from using an E-Tank because I was starting to feel overwhelmed before I made it to the boss and was given a health regenerator. I immediately equipped B, and he helped me through this fight. After that was another fortress stage. Thin platforms with missiles popping up to attack you. Again, just all these challenges with everything you've seen being thrown at you. It was really intense, they really didn't hold back here, and really makes you work for it. I was at 1 hit remaining quicker than I expected I would be. That probably added to my stress, to be honest, and I had to move slowly and carefully through a lot of the stage until I made it to a Susie fight. This variant called a Hunter, and accepted that I'd have to use an E-Tank. I guess the tactic here is Pharaoh Man's fully charged shot. I just kept it charged over my head and let the Hunters run into it, and after that, still no break. The Hunter was more like a mid-boss. As I advanced through more of the stage, I found more items that were out of reach and I had no idea how you're meant to collect them. I also used Rush Jet quite a bit to get through sections. Eventually I tried to blow up these blocks, so I picked up random items and figured out that the ring attack can grab things and bring them back to you, which I wish I had known earlier. I was so excited by this that I actually wanted to go and try it out on the NES version, but apparently that was a feature added to this Game Boy game only. Thankfully, I was able to get 1-ups and E-Tanks now. Anyway, after that, it's another fight against Hunters. The stage changes every time you defeat one, so it's not completely the same. I did have to use a W-Tank to refill my Pharaoh shot though. Again, continued on over narrow platforms, challenges, and dodged difficult enemies, and eventually I made it to the elevator room. I did not expect a boss rush, but thankfully I had restocked some items before making it here, and also super thankful that the bosses are super easy. I then decided to just go in order starting from the top left, and to my surprise it was Toadman, and then Brightman, and then Pharaoh Man, and then Ringman. Okay, so the first 4 elevators were literally placed in weakness order. I don't know if all of the elevator rooms in previous games do that, and I don't care enough to research it, but if someone knows, please leave a comment. The next one was Crystal Man, followed by Stone Man, then Napalm. So I did those ones in reverse weakness order, technically. Not that it really matters, but basically in the elevator room, if you start from the corner and work your way towards the middle, the master you defeat is strong against the next one. which I thought was really interesting. But ultimately, yeah, it's just a boss rush, followed by a quick pathway that takes you to a really cool cutscene. God, I love the production value in this game. So the first phase of this fight, you have to use the giant fists as a platform to target the weak spot. You'll probably take damage, but it's not the worst challenge in the world. The next phase requires you to drop a projectile into a robot's mouth and avoid its attacks. Again, it's not the most challenging thing in the world. I thought one of its attacks was unavoidable, but I figured out just mashing the pea shooter forces it back. Also, I thought I was doing bad, but then I realized you just had to do a short hop to get the projectile in its mouth. The final phase is once again a Wily capsule fight. It's a bit different in that Wily drops explosives that break the stage apart before shuffling over. I used the Pharaoh shot here because it's the best attack for attacking upwards and it worked. Then there's a nice final cutscene that involves Wily escaping while Megaman is trying to leave an exploding ship. When all of a sudden, Ballad drops in and literally sacrifices himself for you to escape, with the sight of Wily's ship exploding in the distance. And I'm not going to sugarcoat it. That Ballad sacrifice was the first bit of storytelling in this entire series that actually garnered an eyebrow raise out of me. It's pretty simple, but it's not anything I've been used to in the series. And I'm kind of excited to see how the storytelling evolves in the franchise, because if this is anything to go by, I'm very excited for when I move on to the SNES games. But as it stands, this was a really good experience. The two different handheld games for this video, Mega Man Game Gear and Mega Man 4 for the Game Boy, both had two very different approaches to how they implemented the Mega Man 4 and 5 elements, and I'd say they were both successful in their own way. Whether it was a one-to-one or completely newly built game, they found a way to bring these games to a handheld and give Game Gear and Game Boy owners a way to experience extremely familiar set pieces and boss fights, and they would have never gotten a chance to experience those games if they didn't own the home consoles. I know there's still Mega Man 5 on the Game Boy coming up, but I've heard that game feels more like its own experience that rivals the NES games. So really, these two titles wrap up the classic era of handheld games. And in a lot of ways, I'm a bit upset that I missed out on these games when I was younger and had a Game Boy. I did briefly borrow a friend's Game Gear for a summer one time, but I mostly just played Sonic games on that. And I'm really starting to realize I've missed out on much more than I initially thought with the Mega Man franchise. And it's such a shame because this series is slowly becoming one of my favorites, and I haven't even made it out of the 8-bit era yet. But anyway, I'm about to get started on Mega Man 6 for the NES. I'll see you next time. As always, thanks for watching. Dean, out.